Media of Art Photography. Okay, alright, so good news here. We don't have as much information here with these next two media we're going to cover. But we do have some information we do need to know, so let's go ahead and move on. So with photography, that basically means light writing or light drawing. And essentially that's what is happening. We're allowing the light to do the drawing for us. And so what we're going to look at is our different processes and different stages in the development of photography. First one we'll go over is the camera obscura. Then we'll move on to the daguerreotype, then the photographic film process, and then color and digital photography, which will be our last two. So let's look at this first one, the camera obscura, because it really takes a while here to develop. Okay, it starts with this observation that camera obscura means it means dark room. And so this is an illustration of that if we have a dark room, one observation that happens that leads to the camera obscura is this, that reflected sunlight, as it passes through a small hole in the wall of a darkened room, it projects onto the opposing wall an inverted image of what lies outside. Okay, so this observation is really observed in a lot of different places, a lot of different times throughout history. And it leads to the development of this, the idea that what one would be able to do is essentially trace whatever the light is drawing for us here if one were to be inside of a dark room. And it leads to this development. So this is essentially what we would call the camera obscura. And so here we have the addition of a lens on the outside, and we also have a mirror on the inside. So the mirror is going to do two things. It's number one, going to take the image of the light that whatever the light is projecting, and it's going to transfer that image to that area there on the outside that the artist can then trace, and it's also going to re-invert that image to where it's right side up. So now the artist doesn't have to stand inside of the dark room and doesn't have to worry about an upside down image. And so this particular device, called the camera obscura again here, there's a lot of literary as well as visual references to these devices, which suggests they've been around since around the 15th century or so. And it's believed that these devices really led for artists to make work a lot more naturalistic. It's believed that that's what led to the Renaissance kind of naturalism that was so much more advanced than the art that preceded it. It's believed to actually have been developed, or should say, it's believed to have led to the invention of scientific or linear perspective. So basically, this object was utilized by artists to help them see proportion and perspective correctly. Okay, so these images didn't necessarily create photographs. They would just basically project a drawing that the artist could then trace. Okay, our first photographic images that we actually have are using cameras that aren't that different than the camera obscura. This is the oldest photograph that we know that still exists here. And a lot of these early photographs, like I said, the cameras weren't that different than the camera obscura. The biggest difference is that instead of the artist tracing what the light is projecting, the artist would just use certain chemicals that are sensitive to light, and the light would essentially draw the image onto, in some cases, a plate. And so that's the process that we see here. Okay, this is called the daguerreotype. The daguerreotype is after the guy who basically refines the process. His name is Jacques Daguerre, and so we call it the daguerreotype. And with his process, he would expose silver plates in the presence of a mercury vapor, which would be sensitive to light. And so that would essentially bite or create the image onto the metal plate. Then you would fix that with a mineral salt solution, and then you'd print positives off of that plate. Okay, and so we see the result of that here. And so if you notice in certain areas, some areas come out a little bit clearer than others. If we notice in the background, it gets a little bit hazy, especially as that street goes further and further back. And that's an example of atmospheric perspective, something we learned about when we looked at space. That there's going to be dirt and particles in the atmosphere that are going to make things harder to see as you go further back. And certainly with the dirt that would be accumulating from the street, we can see that that's the case, that the camera is having a hard time reading the lights and darks because of that. Another thing that this photograph illustrates is the difficulty with early photography, and that is it has very long exposure times for the acids or the chemicals that are sensitive to light to make the image. It's going to have to be exposed for a certain period of time. And so that's why we don't see any traffic in the street. That the street here is actually in the middle of Paris on an afternoon. So you would have had a lot of traffic, a lot of foot traffic, a lot of horse and carriages, buggies, those types of things. But that's not picked up because all of that would have been in motion. And something needs to be still for the camera to be able to pick it up at this point. And so that's why also the shadows are a little bit weird. They're not as static and as normal as most of the shadows we're used to because of the long exposure time. A funny little tidbit about this one is if you look in the lower left corner where the bend of the street on the corner there, we will actually see a figure. We'll actually see a couple figures if we look close enough. And it's one of those funny happenstance in histories where we have our first people that are being photographed here, the first people that show up in the history of photography. And they show up because basically one guy stops to get his shoe shined. You can see that that's the pose he's taking there. Okay, so this is an example of the daguerreotype, one of our first processes here that really gives us a quality image. Okay, a couple of things that photography is really used for early on. The daguerreotype we just looked at was from around 1838, 1839, somewhere in there. And it's going to develop throughout the 1800s, and the process is going to get more and more refined. But from the beginning, one thing that we see it used for is portraiture. That even if it takes several minutes to get your portrait done, it's still a lot quicker than several hours or days using the skills of a trained artist. And so we see a lot of portraiture. And one thing we'll notice from portraiture around this time is most people have either a somber or straight look on their face. And the reason why is because of that long exposure time, that you wouldn't be able to smile for more than a couple minutes at a time. And so artists would instruct their subjects to have a relaxed look on their face. Okay, so that's why you'll see that from photos around this time. It's not that everybody was miserable in the 1800s necessarily. It was just that they had to have a relaxed look on their face so the camera could do an accurate job with their likeness. Another thing early photography does a lot is landscapes. And it's a good way to basically see the world. We can kind of take it for granted because we have always kind of had images around us in our era here. But that wasn't always the case. That really with photography, it's the first time in the history of the world that we have realistic images of the world without some trained use, a trained use of some artist. And so it would allow you to see, these cool kind of landscapes from the Great West. You'd be able to see, what China or Europe or different areas of the world would look like through photography, which you wouldn't have been able to do before if you weren't able to have the time and the money to visit those places. So as photography develops, we get into our next process, which is called the photographic film process. And this is around the year 1900 or so that we're developing film at this point. And the advantage to film here, instead of using some kind of plate and exposing the plate to some kind of chemical, is that with film you can take the picture with your camera just using a click, and now photographs really just take an instant instead of that long exposure time. And the advantage here with film is that you can take the film and you can develop it later on in a darkroom. Okay, so you could take your roll of 36 or however many you would have in your roll, and then later you could do the developing and you could do the editing. And as long as you had a film negative, you could print as many positives off of that negative. Okay, and so this is really kind of the dominant form of photography for quite a long time. And with it here, we have artists that are really using the process for artistic purposes. That for a long time, photography is just used as kind of a tool. We see it used in journalism, science, advertising. There's a lot of things that we see it used for, and it really isn't until this time that artists are really using it as an artistic medium. And so this is an example of that. This is the artist Henri Cartier-Bresson. He has a lot of really interesting photographs, but one of the things he was interested in is kind of this idea of the decisive moment, that the strength of the photograph is that you could basically now at this point take it in an instant and it could show the moment that something's happening or the moment before something's happening, like we see here. And so this artist, along with Alfred Stieglitz, Man Ray, and a few other artists that are using photography, really help it become a respected artistic medium. Now, if you notice, most of our photographs to this point have been monotone. They've either been black and white or some kind of sepia tone. You do have some early examples of color photography, but frankly, they're not that good. That we see color really kind of begin in a couple instances in the 1800s, but in 1907 we have the invention of positive color transparencies, but it's still not the best form of photography, really. In terms of detail, in terms of accuracy, it just does not have the quality of our other methods. You see color develop more in advertising and film than anything else. In the 1930s, we really start to see color photography develop, especially in the film industry. For instance, I think Gone with the Wind, if I'm not mistaken, is one of the first color movies, and I think that was in the late 30s or so when that was happening. Because you still had some difficulties with color, and that's why artists would generally shun color at this point. Because they were the processes were unreliable. They would lead to inaccurate color. A lot of times the value was not as accurate as the black and white. In the event that you would get the color right, it would fade a lot, and you just would not have as much detail. So it does take a while before color is embraced by the artistic community. One of the artists that really helps develop color and bring it to prominence is this artist. His name was William Eggleston. He had a very direct type of style, I guess you could say. He would see something and then he would take a photograph of something he found interesting. But what he was good at was translating a lot of the color techniques that were used in advertising and journalism and those types of things, and bringing them more into the artistic realm. And so something like this, for instance, would be an example of how color might be beneficial. You can see here what the artist is finding interesting is the way that the light is passing through that cola, and how it is giving these interesting kind of lighting effects through the shadow there. Okay, and so this image would be a lot more interesting in color than it would be in black and white, because we have the warmth of the cola versus the cool nature of the sky as the light passes through here. Okay, and so color does take a while to emerge, but eventually it does. And then we move on to the era that we're in now, digital photography. Okay, and so with digital photography, we're using files instead of a chemical process to create our images. And there's a couple of big advantages with digital photography now. Number one is the convenience. You don't have to go to a darkroom to develop your film. You can do the editing right there instantaneously with digital photography. You don't have to develop it and wait till you see what it looks like and then go back into your roll, get onto your contact sheet, take your negative image, and then print off of your positive image. You don't have to worry about all that. It's a very instantaneous process with digital. You can simply click, see if you like it or not, keep it, or not keep it. Pretty simple. The other advantage is all of the manipulation you can do with digital photography. You've always been able to manipulate photography. There's different processes you could do, like splicing different images. You could dodge and burns, another technique you can do as well. It's just with digital photography, it's a lot easier to go ahead and manipulate images. And so something like this would be fairly easy. All you would have to do is take a color photograph, and then in the areas that you want it black and white, you could just go into your computer and you could turn down the saturation. And so because of the usage of the computer to be able to manipulate images, you can have an almost endless variety of things you can accomplish with digital photography. So much so that traditionally photography was kind of like a proof of something that happened, because the camera was something that couldn't lie. But now when we see an image, a lot of times, if it's a pretty extraordinary image, we'll just automatically assume that it's been photoshopped. In fact, sometimes online I'll see little countdowns of images you won't believe aren't photoshopped. And so you can see that whole role reversal has happened with modern photography here. And of course, it's opened the door for each one of us to take photographs almost on a whim here with our phones. That's how so many of the images in today's world are created, through our digital devices, whether they be phones or what have you. And so something like this, someone taking a selfie here, would be an example of something you can do here with digital photography. Alright, so let's just make sure here with photography that we know the chronological order in which these things develop. That we start with the camera obscura, we move down to the daguerreotype, then our photographic film, then color photography, and lastly digital photography.